Well, we're listening to parents and listening to the community, and I want to see kids off their devices and onto the footy fields and the swimming pools and the tennis courts. We want them to have real experiences with real people, because we know that social media is causing social harm. This is a scourge. We know that there is mental health consequences for what many of the young people have had to deal with. The bullying that can occur online, the access to material which causes social harm, and parents are wanting a response.
Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, as the country looks to impose age limits on social media websites, and Canberra is looking to introduce these new laws before an election is due within the next 9 months. Let's bring our Australia Government reporter Ben Westcott, who joins us now with the latest. So, sparse on details, right? But what are the sort of framework that we're looking at that the government is proposing?
Sure. So the broad laws that the government's planning to impose are age limits on social media between the ages of about 14 and 16. They haven't decided on the exact age they're going to look at this stage. That there's some who are looking at 16. The Prime Minister himself said he favours 14, and actually it varies across states and territories what they're looking at as well. Now, in terms of how this would work, that is the big question, and the government is already doing a couple of age verification trials to try and restrict access to, sensitive online websites such as pornography for people below the age of 18. They're going to sort of turn that age verification trials into how they'll do this restriction on social media. But how that looks, whether the technology is viable, none of those questions have really been answered yet.
How have social media companies reacted so far?
Well, so far, most have been quite cautious, but the head of the tech entrepreneur, Elon Musk, who owns X, formerly known as Twitter, has described the measure as fascist, in particular labelling the Australian government as fascists for imposing this measure. While that's very strong language, it isn't the first clash between the Australian government and Elon Musk. They fought earlier this year over a push by the Australian government to get X to remove some videos of a Sydney-based terrorist attack from social media websites, a fight that eventually made headlines around the world.
Is this the first clash that we've seen between the government and tech giants?
No, not at all. This is really the latest in the series of measures the Australian government has put together since it came to power in May 2022, which have sought to crack down the power of social media companies. And most of this legislation is still sort of either in the process of being pitched, being running its way through Parliament, or being enacted. There's a large suite of measures. As we've mentioned, there's the age verification trials. There's also an intended bill to crack down on misinformation and disinformation on social media, which is also very controversial, particularly among Conservative parties who accuse it of being an attack on free speech. In addition to that, the government has also taken on companies such as Facebook, Meta, and Google over claims that it is ripping off Australian media companies. Meta has refused to continue to pay to use Australian news, and as a result, the government is now considering forcing Meta to pay dividends to Australian media companies, which would just be another front in this war on social media, which clearly the government thinks must be electorally popular. And to be honest, polling so far has shown that their crackdown on teenagers using social media is a popular measure, with almost 60% of the population approving of it.
Australian Government reporter Ben Westcott there with the latest. And let's bring in Alicia Rodriguez, who joins us now. They're a research fellow at the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child at Queensland University of Technology. Alicia, really great to have you with us. It's interesting, Ben talked about polling and how broadly supportive of concept I think a lot of parents would be on this topic. We're very sort of short on details as to how this would work. Are you suggesting that this would not work and perhaps could be detrimental when it comes to a sort of, I guess, whole of childhood and teenagehood experience for kids?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the Digital Child, we recognise that children are growing up in a digital world. And these kind of knee-jerk responses by the government, which, importantly to say, aren't evidence-based. The age assurance trial is still ongoing. The evidence from that hasn't been reported on. There's also been a joint select committee on social media in Australian society. That also hasn't, the government hasn't produced any findings from that yet. So the Prime Minister's announcement that they're looking at banning children appears to be a knee-jerk reaction, and who loses out in this situation are children and young people who are growing up in a digital world.
The stakes are so very high, though, so you can sort of perhaps not blame policymakers for having this knee-jerk reaction and wanting, you know, even a band-aid fix or a quick fix, right? How do you balance out the two sides, right? Because as you state in your research, the internet was not created for minors, for children in mind. So how do you regulate that in a way that, you know, works for younger people?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really important to frame this as it's a band-aid solution to kind of look at banning social media. And just to also really underscore, absolutely, like this is a pressing issue. Understandably, parents are concerned, educators are at a loss, something needs to be done, but excluding children is not the answer, and actually looking towards something such as creating and supporting a children's internet is. And this phrase, the children's internet, is really useful because we can look to things like children's television, which we understand in Australia as a public good. We have government investment to produce high quality children's content. And we also have frameworks such as the classification system to help parents make informed decisions about what types of things are appropriate for their children to be engaging with at different ages and stages. And so that's the solution that we should be looking towards, is having really nuanced, robust, evidence-based conversations with consultation with children and young people of how do we create internet spaces that are appropriate, enjoyable, and safe for them.
But children's television, for example, is something that you can just switch the channel on. So when it comes to the internet, there's so much content out there. How do you make sure that children actually go to those right types of content that you're talking about and to the children's internet without really having to ban some of the other areas that they could be influenced by?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And this is the important distinction between the children's internet and children's television, is that the children's internet is made up of a really diverse, you know, array of products, services, and content that is specifically made for children and things that are not made for children but likely to be accessed. I think a really important thing to highlight is that children don't want to be seeking out things that are not age appropriate. You know, children want to be going to the spaces where their peers are, where they can have fun, where they can learn, where they can explore, and they can take risks in really safe ways. So the thing is that we need to be creating those spaces that children want to be going towards. And that requires investment and also regulatory frameworks to hold tech companies accountable so that they are making those spaces to be appropriate for children and young people.
I'm not sure that's completely true if we're talking about rebellious teenagers, you know, going into the internet and trying to do things that they're not supposed to be doing. But how would you incentivize private companies to come up with these types of content and try to lure younger people?
Yeah, really great point. And just to point out with this ban as well, this is one of the problematic things about the ban, is that there's a question of what does the government even mean by social media? And if what they mean by social media is the major platforms, it means that children will go and seek out experiences in more low quality, riskier, less moderated spaces, right? So this is why we need to be working towards having these like incentivizing these spaces for children to be going to. And I think that part of this important conversation is, as a society, we're putting ourselves in a you know, between a rock and a hard place when we're having these conversations, because on one hand, you know, we understand that children are online, that they are seeking out these experiences, but then on the other, we're very upset towards tech companies and the ways in which they're approaching children's spaces, children's data, children's privacy, right? And so we have to actually come together and work towards having really strong regulatory processes, but also working with tech companies, with consultation, with children, with families, with educators and civil society groups to create meaningful spaces that children want to hang out in.
We've seen before that working with tech companies, by and large do not prioritise mental health, right? Whether you're talking about adults or children. We know that Meta, for example, through the whistleblower documents back in 2021, knew about the adverse effects on mental health of Instagram, for example, on young girls. They have this research and this knowledge. So I do wonder when it comes to punitive measures to crack down on this sort of thing, punitive measures to crack down on misinformation, which has led Elon Musk to call Australia, the government fascist. Do you think there's a strong role for that side of things to be played out here?
Yeah, like there has to be some type of enforcement. That's the way that it will hold tech companies accountable. But I guess it just has to be one of these things that we're finding ourselves, like I said, between a rock and a hard place. And as this is entering the national conversation, we all understand that something needs to be done. And part of that is we have to work together. Industry, government, civil society groups, educators. We need to have consultations and we need to come together and start solving this problem in a really robust way and evidence-based way and not a knee-jerk reaction.